you might say, officially concluded our study of the history between the Testaments. But by request, we're going to do kind of a two-part series on the Sadducees and the Pharisees because they figure so prominently in especially the gospel accounts of the New Testament and somewhat in the book of Acts as well. And so I thought it would be helpful to us to take a little bit of a look at those. So tonight we'll look at the Sadducees. Next week, of course, we'll all be in the auditorium for singing service. And then, Lord willing, the week after that, we'll take a look at the Pharisees. And then, I know it's not a quarter division, but y'all know I can't stay on track with quarter division. So my intention after that is to begin a new study. And we've had a request to study what I'm going to call a survey of Paul's epistles. And the idea being to place Paul's epistles in their historical, geographical context, both in terms of the story of the development of the church, and also in terms of learning something about the people to whom the epistles were written, as much as we can, to understand the culture into which Paul was writing, as well as the times surrounding which he was writing, the occasions of writing, things of that nature. You know that if I start to get into the text of Paul's epistles, well, none of us will survive it. That study would never, ever end. I mean, I spent, 2 years on Ezra and didn't finish that. COVID killed it for us. So I will try not to delve too deeply into the text because if I did, we'd never complete that study. But to try and take a sort of an overview survey kind of look at the history and culture and linguistic issues and things like that surrounding each of Paul's epistles. But tonight we look at the Sadducees. And when we think about the Sadducees, one of the first questions that might arise is, where on earth do you come up with a name like Sadducee? And Sadducee is kind of a Latinized version of a Greekized version of an Aramaic word that was in itself a derivative of a Hebrew name. As best we can tell, it was a reference to Zadok, the high priest. Now, if you go back to your Old Testament and you look at, and I've just given you some representative passages, Zadok figures very prominently in the story of David the king down into the time of the reign of Solomon, which places Zadok in a period of history in which he would have been the first high priest to officiate in the temple. Remember that until the time of Solomon, there was no temple. There was a tabernacle, and the tabernacle, it seems, had fallen to some degree into disuse and disrepair until the time of David, when David ends up moving it into Jerusalem, moving the ark into Jerusalem, and setting up the worship of God centered in the city of Jerusalem, which I believe was a fulfillment of prophecy. But then he begins to lay the groundwork for the building of a temple. In fact, he wanted to build a temple. Remember this? But God wouldn't let him, 2 Samuel chapter 7. But God did allow his son Solomon to build the temple. And while he lived, David made every preparation he could to have everything ready for his son to begin the construction as soon as he assumed the throne. And by all accounts, that's essentially what happened. And so Zadok becomes the first high priest to officiate in the new temple. And it seems that this group of people took his name in the sense of the sons of Zadok, as in those who follow after him or represent his administration. Okay? Which lends itself to what we know a little bit later on about the fact that the Sadducees, in a large part, comprised a great many of the priests, but also of the aristocracy of the Jews in Palestine. And this is largely a Palestinian Jew phenomenon. In other words, we don't read about Sadducees among the Jews in Babylon, nor do we read about Sadducees among the Jews who were living in Egypt. But in Palestine we do, and they were quite influential. As a matter of fact, most of the Hasmoneans that we've just finished studying would have identified with the Sadducees, with a couple of notable exceptions. Okay? So we have this idea of those who are referring to themselves as the sons of Zadok, as in having a special province and connection to the temple. Now, it's probably worth noting that the temple that the Sadducees would have been related to is not the same temple that Zadok would have officiated in. That temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC when the Babylonians sacked the city of Jerusalem. The temple they would have officiated in, or would have been worshiping at, was the temple that was built by Zerubbabel in the, let's see, I believe it was finished in 516 BC, and that was the temple that stood until the time of Jesus, with the notable point that it was entirely renovated by Herod the Great. And renovated is probably not even strong enough of a term, because Herod built a new temple over the old temple and carried the pieces out the front door, is essentially what he did. But you'll read about in the literature, you'll read about the first temple period, which would be from the time of Solomon to the Babylonian captivity, and then the second temple period, which is from Zerubbabel to 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Okay? So they would have been affiliated with the second temple. Their origins are not nearly as clear, and I apologize already that font's so small on the screen. Their origins are not very clear at all. We simply don't have very much in the way of historical writings that explain the origins of the Sadducees. Josephus mentions them as one of three sects, the other two being the Pharisees and the Essenes, that he said were from very ancient times. Best we can tell, that means probably at least predating the Maccabean revolt. But it's difficult to pin down very ancient times as to exactly when that is from Josephus's point of view. And so that's pretty much all we have to go on. One of the reasons that's all we have to go on is that it appears that the Sadduceic writings that would have existed would have been largely destroyed with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 by the Romans. And those which survived fell drastically out of favor after the destruction of the temple. The Pharisaic mindset, specifically the mindset that said we not only follow the law of Moses, but we follow the traditions of the elders, what we come to know as the Talmud, and the oral traditions and things of that nature. Those came to be heavily predominant in the years following the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 70 CE. And that means that the Jewish people, rejected the Sadducee point of view, which was, we only follow that which is written. And some of them even went so far as to say, we only follow that which is written in the Torah. Okay, so they totally rejected the idea of an oral tradition, of traditions of the fathers, things of that nature, and consequently they fell out of favor with the vast majority of Jews following the destruction of the Second Temple, and their writings did not survive. So we just don't have a lot to go on in terms of their origin. Now, we can say a couple of things about their origins. Number one, they seem to be on the scene from pretty early in the Hellenistic period. In other words, when Alexander the Great comes along in 333 BCE and overthrows the Persian Empire and begins to assert Greek influence in Palestine, it seems that the Sadducees are perhaps already there. Now that's interesting to me, because for a group to be identified as a specific group, they almost have to be identified that way in opposition to some other group. In other words, you don't just clan up and name yourself and begin to practice certain things unless there's somebody else that's not doing that you're sort of protesting against. And so for the Sadducees to exist that early indicates to me that there were people who didn't follow their way of practice and their way of thinking among the Jews in Palestine that they were differentiating themselves from. Who that is, we're not really sure. Did the Pharisees exist in some form that early on? Not sure. The Sadducees certainly tried to distinguish themselves from the Pharisees and said some things that were harshly critical of the Pharisees later on in history, once we know both groups are existing side by side. But they exist, it seems, pretty early on in the Greek period. Now, Josephus at one point relates a legend, and I'll relate the legend to you, but I want you to understand that this is a legend, and it's almost certainly not true because Josephus's own account undermines this legend later on. Okay? But the legend that he relates is that there was a man by the name of Antigonus of Saco, a successor of Simon the Just, who were some of the last of the men of the great synagogue, scholars of the Babylonian age. And he taught a maxim which said, "Be not like servants who serve their master for the sake of wages, but rather be like those who serve without thought of receiving wages." And his students, two in particular, one named Zadok and another named Bothus, took that to mean that there is no afterlife in which you're either rewarded or punished for the choices you make. And therefore, the Sadducee idea of denying a resurrection and things of that nature grew out of this maxim that they probably misunderstood. Now, again, I say that's a legend because, for one thing, the individual that he identifies as Bothus, well, he was a contemporary of Herod the Great, which means he didn't exist until at least a couple of centuries after we know Sadducees already existed. Okay. The other is that there was some heretic by the name of Zadok who gave them his name. Is pretty unlikely. It's much more likely that they named themselves after Zadok, the high priest in the time of David and Solomon. So I would say that that's a legend. However, it brings up one important point. Uniformly, those who describe the beliefs of the Sadducees will say that they reject the concept of an afterlife. They reject the idea that anything that we do here is going to result either in reward or punishment after we die. Now, let's think about the ramifications of that just a moment. If this life is all there is, and there is neither reward nor punishment on the other side, what then drives you in this life? There really are only two options that I can see. One would be to say we do what we do out of a sense of duty and altruism, with no expectation of reward nor fear of punishment, but simply because it's the right thing to do. The other is the old Epicurean maxim, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And from what I can tell, it seems that the Sadducees preach the one and practice the other. Preach the one of be altruistic and do what you do out of a sense of duty with no expectation of reward. But they very clearly practiced living lives of luxury. You might have noticed on the title slide that we described the Sadducees as priestly aristocrats. And as best we can tell from the historical writings we have, they were almost uniformly always the upper class of Palestinian Jewish society, and pretty much everybody else didn't like them. But they lived very wealthily, and they lived in ease, and several of the historical writers describe them as using gold and silver implements in their feasts, and pointedly not partaking in the sort of asceticism that the Pharisees partook in. In other words, the Pharisees would deny themselves many things and be extremely strict on themselves, and the Sadducees said, I don't know what you hope to gain by that. There's no reward in the afterlife. You might as well just enjoy things. And so they lived like Epicureans and preached like Stoics, I guess you might say. All right, let's talk a little bit about their beliefs. And again, I apologize. I'll try to do a better job in future lessons on getting that font a little bit bigger. For one, they represented the nobility, the power, and the wealth of the Jews in Palestine. And what I mean by that is this. They not only represented them in the sense that that's who they were, they represented them in the sense of statesmanship. The Sadducees took it upon themselves to deal with the other peoples with whom the Jews in Palestine had to interact. So that would include, for example, the Ptolemies in Egypt. For a number of years when the Ptolemies dominated Palestine, they were the ones who by and large stepped up and spoke for the Israelites to the Ptolemies. When the Ptolemies began to award, publicanship, which publicanship was it was sort of a commission type arrangement to collect taxes for the overlord from among the citizens, and whatever you collect over and above what the overlord requires, you get to keep. And it was oftentimes the Sadducees who stepped into that role and then would employ common people to go out and actually do the dirty work of collecting taxes. So they got the rewards, and the people who did the collecting got the infamy. Okay? So they dealt with them. They dealt with the Seleucids. As a matter of fact, it was Sadducee wrangling with the Seleucids that was largely responsible for getting certain people appointed high priest at different times during the history of the dealings with the Seleucids and the Jews. And then, of course, after the Maccabean revolt, it was Sadducees by and large who were the priesthood and would represent the Jews to first the Greeks and then the Romans. And most of the Hasmoneans, which were of course the descendants of the family of Judas the Maccabee, most of the Hasmoneans sided with the Sadducees. And so they took it upon themselves as those of power and wealth and nobility to represent the rest of the people. Secondly, they did not seem to believe in any resurrection or immortal soul. The idea that what we live in this life is all that there is. Number three, they only accepted the written Torah and not the traditions of the elders. And this was one of the main points of contention between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, if they restricted themselves only to the Torah, and some of them did, what's the problem with that? I'm sorry?
We said it was written by man, but I don't know.
Well, the Torah's not. That's the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So in that sense, they would have been right to lean on inspired writ. But what?
Ignore everything else.
They cut out the prophets and the writings, right? The Jews viewed the Old Testament as divided into 3 sections: the law, the prophets, and the writings. Okay? The prophets and the writings were also inspired. But if they held only to the Torah, and many of them did, then they cut out other inspired writings. And so they're drawing their circle of authority smaller than God did. On the other hand, the Pharisees would be guilty of the opposite excess, wouldn't they? They accepted not only the law, the prophets, and the writings, but the traditions of the elders and the things that became the Talmud, the Mishnah, and all of the writings and oral traditions. And so they accepted too much authority. Okay? And so you sort of have 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. But the Sadducees accepted only the written Torah. They denied the existence of angels and demons. At least that's what the book of Acts tells us, and since it was written by inspiration, we'll take that as factual. I say that because that's the only writing that I'm aware of. In other words, we don't find any of the human secular historians who mention that particular detail, but the inspired writer does. They were very rigorous in criminal prosecutions. What I mean by that is this. They held a large portion of the Sanhedrin, which was the Supreme Court. And when cases came before them, they, if a person was convicted of a crime, insisted on carrying out as severely as possible the punishment that the Old Testament allowed for. They were not in any way merciful in their judgments. The Pharisees, at least early on, seemed to incline toward mercy in criminal matters, whereas the Sadducees would insist on an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, things of that nature, imposing the letter of the law in every case. They held that a slave owner was as liable for the acts of his slave as he was for the acts of his animals. Remember the Old Testament passage that talks about if your ox gores someone, you will have certain liability, or if your donkey kicks them, or what have you. Well, the Sadducees said, if your slave goes out and harms someone, you as the slave master are just as liable as you would be if your animal harms someone. The Pharisees, on the other hand, said, wait a minute. The slave is an intelligent human being and has his own sense of volition and his own accountability for his behaviors. And unless the slave master put the slave up to doing the wrong or participated in the wrong in some way, the mere fact that he was the master and this one was the slave doesn't transfer liability to him. So they had an argument about that. Now remember, the Sanhedrin was not only made up of Sadducees, but also a great number of Pharisees. And so this was a point of contention in arguing cases with them. All right. They insisted on a literal application of Deuteronomy 22 and verse 17. I won't go and read that right now, but let me remind you, because once I say it, you're all going to remember the passage I'm talking about. In Deuteronomy 22, the case is discussed where a man marries a woman and then wants to divorce her on the ground that she was not a virgin. And so he brings his cause to the elders of the city, and if her father can bring proof that she is in fact a virgin, then the man who sued for divorce is going to be dealt with harshly. If, on the other hand, they cannot produce proof of her virginhood, then she will be stoned. Remember that? The Sadducees insisted on enforcing that to the letter. And if her father could not produce the physical proof of her virginity, she was to be stoned. So they were very severe in their dealings with the law. They granted the daughter the same right of inheritance as the son's daughter in the case that the son was dead. Now that's an interesting situation here. We had discussed in a sort of by-the-way application a few months back the Jewish tradition of the Beit Ab, the father's house, and how that when a woman married, she would essentially leave her Beit Ab, her father's house, and she would become a member of the Beit Ab that her husband belonged to. And she would become the responsibility of the patriarch of that household. Okay? That was something, for example, that Judah violated. Remember when his two sons had a wife, Tamar, and the two sons died, and he sent her back to her father's house and said, wait there until my third son comes of age? No. He violated the tradition of the land in that way. He should have kept her in his house and kept her up and fed her. She was a member of his Beit Ab, but he sent her back to her father's house, intending to be rid of her. Okay. So the Sadducees said that if the daughter, a daughter will inherit essentially the same as a granddaughter when her father dies. The Pharisees said no, the inheritance goes to the father's house right down the line, and the wife inherits through her husband. Point of contention. Sadducees counted Pentecost from the day after the Sabbath, which would be Leviticus 23:15 through 16, which means that the day of Pentecost always would fall on a Sunday as the Sadducees calculated. The Pharisees, on the other hand, would often simply begin with Passover and count 7 Sabbaths in the next day. So the Pharisee way of counting didn't necessarily always land Pentecost on the first day of the week. And I don't know this for a fact, but I want to ask when I get to heaven. When Luke says in Acts chapter 2 verse 1, now when the day of Pentecost was fully come, I want to ask Luke, why did you include that adverb? Not just when the day of Pentecost was come, but fully come, and did that perhaps refer to the dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees over how you calculate Pentecost, and perhaps he was just in a sort of by-the-way mentioning, no, this is the correct way to calculate. The Sadducees were right on this in terms of following what the Old Testament teaches in terms of calculating Pentecost. And maybe that's what Luke is saying. I don't know. I'll have to ask when I get to heaven. Don't get in line behind me in heaven. I've got way too many questions. All right. Number 10, they claim that the daily burnt offerings, based on Numbers 28 and verse 4, were to be offered by the high priest at his own expense. Now that's an interesting claim for the Sadducees to make, considering most of them were priests and high priests. The Pharisees said no, the daily burnt offerings were to come from the taxes paid by the people. But the Sadducees insisted on the high priest personally footing the bill for the daily burnt offering. I would imagine that'd get rather expensive, wouldn't you? But that was their position. They claimed that the meal offering belonged to the priest's portion, whereas the Pharisees claimed it for the altar. In other words, do you remember what the meal offering was? Back in the opening chapters of the book of Leviticus, Moses outlines for us the different kinds of offerings. The King James Version refers to this as a meat offering, which I always thought was ironic because the one thing it did not have in it was any meat. The Old American Standard calls it a meal offering, and that's more accurate. What he's talking about there is barley flour, cakes of barley flour typically that were being offered, and there was a dispute between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees said the priest who offers gets part of that to eat, along with the animal sacrifice that goes with it. In other words, he gets meat and bread from offering. The Pharisees said, no, it's got to be burned up on the altar. So they were at odds about how to interpret that as well. The Sadducees insisted on an especially high degree of purity in those who officiated at the preparation of the ashes of the red heifer. I don't have time tonight to go through the ceremony involving the red heifer, but to go back in Numbers chapter 19 and read the ritual that involved the red heifer. And I believe the Pharisees may have been in the right on this, but the Sadducees insisted on an extreme level of purification for the person who dealt with the ashes. Number 13, this has to do with the Day of Atonement. All right, now let's just refresh our memory as to what happens on the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest takes an offering. And only on that day is he allowed to enter through the veil from the holy place into the most holy place. In other words, into the presence of God. As long as the Ark of the Covenant persisted, he would have been entering and standing in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And of course, the top of the Ark of the Covenant was referred to as the mercy seat, where the Shekinah, or the presence of God, dwelt. Okay? Under the instructions in the law of Moses, he was to take with him not only the blood offering, but a censer. Y'all know what a censer is? What's a censer?
A vessel for burning incense.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. He said a vessel for burning incense. It's sort of like a small lantern, or a good friend of mine called it a bee smoker. It's not exactly a bee smoker, but it was a sort of two-chambered little pot. And in the bottom chamber, you would place hot coals. And then there would be a bowl or container that was suspended above where the coals went, and you would place powdered incense there. And the heat from the coals would cause the incense to release fragrant smoke. Okay? And the priest was to take the censer and fill the most holy place with the smoke from the censer and then enter. Okay? So the Sadducees and Pharisees had a fight over whether you have to light the censer outside the most holy place or inside the most holy place. And they couldn't agree on that. You see the hair splitting that's going on between these guys? Is it any wonder that Matthew refers to the whole lot of them as lawyers from time to time? You see, lawyers are always causing problems. They extended, the Sadducees did, they extended the power of contamination to indirect as well as direct contact. Now what I mean by that is this. Jared dies. I touch Jared. I'm contaminated. I am now ceremonially impure. I cannot, for example, partake of the Passover until I've let some time go by and purified myself. Now, the Pharisees said, okay, I'm impure. I touched a dead body. The Sadducees said, I'm impure. I touched a dead body. And then I shake hands with Dakota. Now Dakota's impure too, and he can't take the Passover. Transferred impurity. I do not know. I would like to study this and see how far they would allow the chain to go. In other words, is everybody I touch impure, and now everyone Dakota touches is impure, and everybody else who is touched by someone that I touched, eventually the whole nation would be impure, wouldn't it?
So nobody gets participated.
But they did allow for transferred impurity. The water libation, I'm not going to get into this too much, but the Pharisees and Sadducees, if there was anything they could argue over, they found a way to do it. Let's see. I'm not going to get into these too much more because I think there's more that we can talk about. But let's consider this. We've got these Sadducees, all right? They make up a lot of the priests, maybe most of the priests. During the Hasmonean regime, they are not actually descended from Zadok. Zadok is, as I said, the first high priest to officiate in the temple. He was descended from Eleazar. Remember, Aaron had 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Nadab and Abihu died because they offered strange fire before the Lord. And as far as we can tell, died without any issue, or at least their issue never served as priests. That left the 2 younger sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. And as you begin to trace the high priesthood through the Old Testament, it seems that it was most often the sons of Eleazar who were the high priest. The high priest, of course, is the oldest living male direct descendant of Aaron who qualifies as a priest. So you have Zadok here, a high priest descended from Eleazar. But when we get to the Hasmoneans, within the the first generation of Hasmonean rule, we have these Hasmoneans declaring themselves high priest. And they're not descended from Zadok or from Eleazar, or as best we can tell, even necessarily from Ithamar, but from an offshoot. They were Levites, we know that much. But not all Levites were descended from Aaron. There were 3 clans within the tribe of Levi. The clan of Kohath, the clan of Merari, and the clan of Gershom. Kohath was the family from which Moses and Aaron descended. And by the way, that's the word we get our, if you ever met anyone with the last name Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, that's just an Anglicization of the Jewish word for priest. It comes from Kohath, all right? But anyway, you've got these Hasmonean Sadducees serving as high priest, wearing the name of Zadok, presumably, who aren't even descended from Zadok. They probably didn't have any right under the law of Moses to serve as high priest, but by this point in history, the high priesthood has become a matter of political appointment and not a pure descent through the law of Moses anyway, and so it's a matter of political power. And that's essentially what you're dealing with when you deal with the Sadducees in the New Testament. These are wealthy folks, folks with political power, folks with influence in the circles of power, not so much within Palestine, although there too, but internationally. They were movers and shakers on the international scale, and that's how they were able to accomplish so much of what they did. I hope this is helpful to you. I remind you again, we will not meet next week. We'll all be in the auditorium singing, and then, Lord willing, the week after we'll look at Pharisees. Thank you so much for your attention.